Hello, Heartland fans! Jack Bartlett's funeral was not just another farewell. It was the moment the entire valley stood still. A scene so raw, so haunting, that silence itself seemed to bow in grief. The day Hudson laid its patriarch to rest, time slowed, hearts broke, and lives forever changed. This was not the quiet passing of one man. This was the shattering of a legacy, a final goodbye that drew every soul in Hudson to the same place, to bear witness to the end of an era. And yet, beneath the sorrow, beneath the weight of mourning, something else stirred, something unspoken, powerful, and unforgettable. The morning of Jack's funeral was not an ordinary morning. It began with a stillness that felt unnatural, as though even the air itself dared not disturb the sacred weight of the day. A pale, subdued light filtered through the clouds, heavy and mournful, as if the sky was dressed in its own veil of grief. Across Hudson, the signs were unmistakable. The neon glow of Maggie's diner was absent, its door marked instead with a handwritten note that read simply, "Closed to say goodbye." The hardware store, the feed supply, even the little bookshop on the corner, all of them locked, all of them silent. The bustling rhythm of Hudson's life was gone, replaced with a collective pause, an entire community united in grief and reverence. At the heart of it all was the Dude Ranch, where the family moved quietly, each step deliberate, each breath heavy with the reality they could not escape. Their grief was no longer the sharp, shocking pain of Jack's passing. It was now a deeper, more aching weight, the knowledge that today they would carry him away for the last time. Inside, silence reigned, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of people who knew words could not begin to hold the sorrow they felt. Lisa moved first, her strength evident not in her words but in her gestures, straightening Tim's black tie, brushing the faint crease from Lou's sleeve, standing tall with a quiet dignity that masked the storm inside her. She was a pillar, unshaken, though her heart was breaking as much as theirs. Lou stood with Katie and Georgie, her arms wrapped protectively around them, shielding her daughters with a mother's instinct even as her own tears threatened to fall. She had always been the strong one, the leader, the mayor, the voice of reason, but today she was simply a daughter who had lost her father. Amy and Ty stayed close together, drawing silent strength from one another, their hands entwined as if refusing to let go. At their side, little Lindy arranged a bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered at dawn, her young hands trembling but determined, her small act of love cutting deeper than any word ever could. She did not fully understand death, not yet, but she understood goodbye. And in her innocent gesture was the most heartbreaking truth of all, the loss of a grandfather whose presence had shaped her world. And then, outside, the black hearse arrived. Its gleaming surface reflected the cloudy sky above, its presence heavy, final, and impossible to ignore. 6 men stood waiting by its side, Ty, Tim, Peter, Caleb, Scott, and Shane. Together, they formed a solemn wall, the next generation of strength, prepared to carry the patriarch one final time. Their faces were masks of sorrow, their posture rigid with respect. They were not just pallbearers, they were the keepers of a legacy. The men Jack had shaped, guided, and in his own quiet way, made strong enough to stand here today. The family stepped outside, their movement slow and heavy, as though each footfall was weighed down by the gravity of what was to come. The hearse door opened with a sound that cut through the silence, and with practiced reverence, the casket was revealed. It was simple, strong, unpretentious, exactly as Jack would have wanted. The pine gleamed softly in the gray light, beautiful in its honesty, a reflection of the man it carried. One by one, the family entered their cars, the doors closing with soft clicks that echoed like the beating of a drum. The procession began, the hearse leading, the black line of vehicles following. The gravel crunched beneath the slow, deliberate tires, each turn of the wheel marking another step in Jack Bartlett's final journey. And as they moved, the valley seemed to watch. From the windows of ranch houses, from the fences along the roads, people stood in silence. Ranchers, shopkeepers, children, everyone who had ever known him, or even simply known of him, stood in quiet respect. Some bowed their heads, some pressed hats to their chests, others simply watched, their faces lined with grief. The family, locked in their own private sorrow, looked up as the convoy rolled into Hudson, and what they saw left them breathless. The sidewalks were full, 3, 4 people deep, neighbors, friends, rivals, strangers. Every face turned toward them, every heart bound in the same grief. Not one person whispered, not one person moved. They simply stood, united, a town silenced by the passing of its patriarch. For Tim, it was the most unexpected sight of all. He had braced himself for judgment, for the sting of old grudges, for the whispers of a community that had once turned its back. But there was none of that. Instead, he saw old ranchers, men he had fought with over cattle and land, holding their hats to their hearts. He saw waitresses and clerks with tears streaking their faces. He saw respect, love, and something he had not felt from this town in years: forgiveness. In that moment, the anger that had weighed on him dissolved, replaced by something deeper, a shared sorrow that bound him to Hudson in a way he had never expected. Beside him, Lou too saw the town differently. These were her people, the community she had fought for, sometimes resented, sometimes lost faith in. But today, all of that vanished. Today they were united in grief, and Lou felt the last of her bitterness fall away. She saw only love, only regret, only a community that had come together not out of duty, but out of a shared, heartfelt need to honor the man they all knew was irreplaceable. In Heartland Season 19, Amy, holding Lindy's hand, watched as her daughter's eyes widened at the sea of faces. She saw what Lindy saw: respect, love, and the truth that Jack Bartlett had been more than a grandfather. He had been a foundation. Every person on that street had a story, a memory, a kindness tied to him. He had been more than a rancher, more than a father. He had been the valley's heart. The convoy slowed as it reached the church, where an even larger crowd waited: officials, leaders, old rivals, friends, and strangers alike. The toll of the church bell echoed, deep and mournful, carrying across the valley. The men gathered, stepping to the back of the hearse. With reverent care, they lifted the casket onto their shoulders. The weight was immense, not only wood and pine, but the weight of a man's entire legacy, the burden of love, respect, and responsibility now passed to them. The crowd fell utterly silent as the family began their slow walk up the stone steps. The air was heavy with grief, yet somehow also filled with a strange, unspoken unity. Every eye watched, every tear fell in silence, every heart broke together. And as the oak doors of the church opened, as the family carried Jack Bartlett into his final farewell, a single thought echoed through Hudson, unspoken but felt by all. How could one man's passing bring an entire valley to its knees? The doors of the old Hudson church creaked open, and the pallbearers carried Jack's casket through the threshold. At that very moment, a hush fell so absolute it seemed as though the world itself had stopped. The faint light of morning filtered through stained glass windows, casting soft colors across the crowded sanctuary. It was a sea of faces: family, neighbors, friends, and strangers, pressed shoulder to shoulder, every pew filled, the aisles lined, the balcony overflowing. And yet not a word was spoken, not a sound disturbed the sacred silence, save for the gentle tolling of the bell and the low, mournful notes of the organ. Each person who had entered that church carried a piece of Jack Bartlett with them: a kindness remembered, a lesson learned, a moment when his quiet wisdom had shaped their lives. He had never sought recognition, never demanded respect, yet here it was, an entire community gathered to honor the man who had shaped them all. At the front, the casket was placed upon its stand, and the family took their seats, a single row united in sorrow. Lisa sat closest, her hands folded tightly, her face calm, but her eyes glistening. Tim sat beside her, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched, a man struggling to contain emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. Lou sat further down with Katie and Georgie pressed against her sides, their small hands clinging to her arms as though they could draw strength from her. And then Amy, with Ty and Lindy, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the casket as if trying to hold her grandfather's presence for just a few moments more. The minister rose, his voice calm but weighted with emotion. He spoke not of death, but of life, of Jack's life, a life of honesty, of work, of love. He spoke of a man who had given more than he ever took, who had lived not for himself, but for his family and his community. Each word struck like a bell, reverberating through the hearts of all who listened. But for the family, it was not enough. Words could not capture him. Words could not fill the hollow left in their lives. When the time came for personal tributes, the silence grew heavier. Tim was the first to stand. For a moment, his legs wavered, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was not a man who found words easily, especially in moments of vulnerability. Yet when he spoke, his voice was raw, jagged, stripped of all pretense. He spoke of his father-in-law not just as the man who had raised his daughter's world, but as the man who had saved his own. He admitted the fights, the anger, the distance, but also the respect, the lessons, and the love he had never found the courage to say aloud until now. His words cracked, his shoulders trembled, but his message was clear. Jack Bartlett had been his rock, his rival, and, in the end, his truest friend. Lou followed, her voice steady, her composure fragile but determined. She spoke as a daughter, but also as a mother. She reminded them all of the grandfather who had always been there. At birthdays, at Christmases, at school plays, at moments of joy and despair alike. She told of how he had guided her through the chaos of leadership, even when they disagreed, even when she resisted. She told of his quiet patience, his stubborn faith, his endless well of wisdom. And when her voice faltered, when tears threatened to break her resolve, Katie reached out and placed her small hand in her mother's, steadying her. Heartland Season 19. Amy's turn came, and for a long moment she could not rise. Her hand gripped ties so tightly that her knuckles turned white. When she finally stood, her voice was soft, trembling, but filled with a depth of love that silenced the room even further. She spoke of the man who had taught her to ride, who had taught her to listen, who had taught her that horses and people needed patience and understanding more than force. She told the church that Jack Bartlett was not just her grandfather. He was her teacher, her guide, her anchor. Every step of her life, every lesson she lived by, every value she carried came from him. And now, she said through breaking tears, it was her turn to carry those lessons forward. For Lindy, for the ranch, for everyone. As Amy sat down, unable to continue, the organ swelled once more. The room was thick with grief, but also with something more. An unspoken promise, a vow from every heart present that Jack's legacy would not end here. His spirit lived on in each person he had touched, and in this church, that truth was undeniable. But as the music faded, and as the casket rested in its quiet dignity before the altar, one thought loomed heavy in every mind. They had gathered to say goodbye, yes, but how does a family, a community, a valley ever truly say goodbye to the man who had held them all together? When the final words inside the church had been spoken, and the last notes of the organ faded into silence, the family knew there was still one more step to take. The service had been powerful, heartbreaking, unifying, but it was not the end. The true farewell waited outside, in the quiet place where Jack Bartlett would rest forever. And so, the family rose again, their faces pale and drawn, their bodies heavy with the exhaustion of grief. The pallbearers stepped forward, their shoulders squared, their breath steady, preparing themselves for the weight they had to carry one last time. The oak doors opened, and the cold October air rushed in. Outside, the crowd was even larger than before, spilling across the churchyard and out into the street. The tolling of the bell continued, deep and slow, each chime striking the heart like a hammer. The 6 men lifted the pine casket once more, their movements slow, reverent, perfectly in sync. Together, they carried Jack out into the gray light of day, each step echoing against the stone steps, each footfall a reminder of the finality of this journey. The crowd parted as they passed, hats lowered, heads bowed, tears streaking silent faces. People who had known Jack only in passing wept openly. Those who had worked beside him for decades stood rigid, their hands shaking as they fought to remain composed. No one dared to speak. No one dared to break the sanctity of the moment. The procession moved down the lane, the family close behind. At the cemetery on the hill, where the land sloped gently toward the valley Jack had loved all his life, the final place was ready. The ground was soft, the earth freshly turned, the hole yawning open like a wound. The crowd gathered in a wide circle, surrounding the Bartlett family with silent solidarity. From that hill, the ranch could be seen in the distance, its fences stretching across the fields, the barn standing strong against the horizon. It was fitting. Jack would rest where he could watch over the land forever. As the pallbearers lowered the casket onto the straps above the grave, silence deepened. Lisa reached out, brushing her fingers against the pine lid, a whisper of love only she could hear. Tim placed his hand firmly on the wood, his jaw tight, his eyes glistening, his voice low and rough as he muttered a goodbye he could not say in public. Lou leaned forward, pressing a trembling kiss against her fingertips before laying them gently on the casket, whispering, "Thank you, Dad." Amy stood frozen, Lindy clinging to her hand. For a moment she could not move, but then with Ty's steady hand on her shoulder, she bent down and laid the bouquet of wildflowers, Lindy's flowers, on top of the wood. It was the simplest gesture, yet it broke the silence like nothing else could. The flowers, bright and fragile, against the hard pine and the dark soil, were a symbol of innocence, of continuity, of life carrying on even as death claimed its due. The minister spoke the final words, his voice shaking as he gave the last blessing. And then the straps moved, slow and steady, lowering the casket into the earth. The sound of rope sliding against wood was sharp, almost unbearable. The box descended inch by inch until it disappeared into the shadow of the ground. At that moment, the valley seemed to weep with the family. One by one, the family stepped forward with small handfuls of earth. Lisa's hand trembled as she let the soil fall, the dirt hitting the lid with a dull, final sound. Tim followed, his fist clenched so tightly around the soil that his knuckles were white, his hand shaking as he finally let go. Lou's tears streamed freely as she dropped her handful, Katie and Georgie stepping forward beside her, whispering words only the wind carried away. Amy held Lindy's hand as together they dropped their soil, the child's tiny palm releasing the earth with wide, tear-filled eyes. The rest of the community followed, one after another, each person adding a handful, each person leaving behind a piece of their grief. By the time the final clumps of soil had fallen, the grave was covered in a patchwork of earth and flowers, a mosaic of love, sorrow, and remembrance. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of the wind in the trees, the cries of distant crows, and the muffled sobs of those who could no longer hold their grief inside. Yet even in that sorrow, there was something else, a strange strength, a sense of unity that bound everyone on that hill together. They had lost a man, but in that loss they had found each other again. The family stood as one, staring at the mound of earth that now held their patriarch. None of them spoke, none of them moved. The valley had changed forever. They knew it. They felt it. The man who had been the heart of Heartland was gone, and nothing would ever be the same. But as the crowd began to disperse, as people slowly drifted away with bowed heads and heavy steps, one question lingered in every heart, echoing in the silence like a thunderclap waiting to fall. Without Jack Bartlett, who would lead them now? And yet, even as the last hymn quieted and the minister's words settled like falling ash, it was clear that Jack Bartlett's story was not ending inside that church. The echoes of his life reached beyond the walls, into the hearts of every single person in Hudson. As the doors opened, sunlight struck through the dark clouds, lighting the path that led to the waiting carriage. And in that strange, fleeting glow, the coffin seemed to shine, not as a symbol of loss, but as a reminder of how brightly Jack had lived, how deeply he had loved, and how completely he had given himself to Heartland. Every man, woman, and child stepped forward together, a procession unlike any seen before, where grief and gratitude blended into one unbroken stream. And in that moment, the town felt less like a collection of neighbors and more like a single family, united by the mark Jack had left upon them all. But the silence outside was heavier than any hymn sung inside. Horses lined the fences, their breaths clouding the air as if they too understood this final ride was different, that this was not just another farewell, but the closing of a chapter written in sweat, blood, and love across the very soil of Hudson. The sound of hooves against gravel was muted, as though the earth itself softened in respect. And as the carriage began to roll forward, the crowd moved with it, no one willing to stay behind, no one ready to let go just yet. Tears streaked faces, young and old, but behind every tear was pride. A pride that Hudson had known a man like Jack Bartlett, a man whose quiet strength would echo for generations. Yet beneath that pride was a question none dared to voice. If the anchor of Heartland was gone, could the family and the town hold steady against the storms yet to come? In Heartland Season 19, for Amy Lou and the rest of the family, walking behind that carriage was like moving through a dream they could not wake from. Every step was a memory, every breath a struggle. It was Lou who broke first, her hand gripping Amy's, her shoulders shaking, whispering through her tears that she could not imagine a world without Grandpa Jack. Amy, though fighting her own storm inside, held firm, her eyes locked forward on the carriage, her jaw tight with a strength Jack himself had taught her. Katie clung to Lou's other side, looking lost and frightened, as though some part of her childhood had been ripped away too soon. And Tim's face was unreadable, hardened like stone, but his eyes betrayed him. He looked at that coffin as though it carried not only Jack, but all the unspoken words, the unfinished reconciliations, the regrets he had never managed to face. It was as if Jack's silence now spoke louder than any argument they had ever had, and the question burned deeper. Could Tim ever forgive himself now that Jack would never answer? Behind them, friends and neighbors followed, their grief mixed with whispers of Jack's kindness, his advice, his stubborn ways, his unshakable sense of honor. Stories passed between them like fragile treasures, each one reminding them that Jack's life had not only shaped Heartland, but had shaped Hudson itself. Some spoke of how he had stood up for them when no one else would. Others remembered the quiet moments, the small acts of care, the lessons shared by a fire, the calm strength that had guided them when everything seemed lost. Every word painted a portrait not of a hero from afar, but of a man who had lived among them, carried their burdens, and given everything without ever asking for anything in return. Yet even in the warmth of those stories, the cold truth remained. Hudson would never be the same without Jack Bartlett. And deep down, they all knew it. As the carriage reached the old Bartlett plot, where generations had been laid to rest, the air turned still. Birds fell silent, the wind paused, as though the whole valley bowed in respect. Amy stepped forward first, her voice trembling but strong as she whispered a promise only she could make, that she would carry on Heartland, that she would not let Jack's legacy fade, that she would honor him not with words but with the life she would live. Lou followed, her tears flowing freely as she vowed to protect the family, to keep Hudson together, no matter how heavy the burden. And then, in a voice cracked but unyielding, Tim spoke, admitting for the first time that everything he was, for better or worse, was because of Jack. His voice broke when he said he was sorry. Sorry for the fights, sorry for the wasted years, sorry for not saying the words when Jack could still hear them. The silence that followed was suffocating, as though the whole town had been waiting for that truth, and as though the valley itself grieved not only for Jack's loss, but for the wounds that would now never heal. And as the final shovels of earth fell upon the coffin, a strange calm settled over Hudson. It was not the calm of peace, but the calm of change, the kind that comes when something too big, too sacred, has been lost. Amy stood tall, Lou beside her, Tim with his head bowed, the entire town encircling them in a shield of shared pain. Yet even as they lowered their heads, they could not shake the haunting weight pressing on them. Without Jack Bartlett, the heart of Heartland was gone. And though they would move forward, though they would carry his name and his memory, the question carved into every soul was the same. If Hudson could lose Jack Bartlett, what else could it lose? Thank you.